So, like we said, the first four sections of RDA describe the guidelines and instructions for assigning attributes to resources. And each of these sections assigns attributes to a different one of the entity types from Ferber's classes, or from Ferber's entities. So, section 1 assigns attributes to manifestations and items. Section 2 assigns attributes to works and expressions. Again, it divides them into two sections, since the manifestations and items are concrete and works and expressions are abstract. Section 3 describes how to assign attributes to persons and corporate bodies, and Section 4 describes how to assign attributes to concepts. So as you can see, no matter what type of entity it is, any type of entity can have attributes, and attributes are just characteristics. And so RDA allows the vocabulary for characteristics to be systematically described, and then those different attributes and then those different entity types can be associated with information resources. So information resources start taking on, either directly or indirectly, the characteristics of the entities that are related with them. Similarly, in sections 5 through 8 that describe relationships, we again see a systematic breakdown for how to describe relationships among different groups of entities. So, section 5 is instructions for describing relationships among any of the four different content entities. So, among work and expression, expression and item, manifestation and item, so on and so forth. So that's all described in section 5. In section 6, we learn how to describe relationships between content entities and agent entities, so between content and persons, families, and corporate bodies. Section 7 is for describing relationships between works and subjects. Again, there's your subject cataloging, your aboutness. Section 8 is for describing relationships among related content entities. So instead of describing direct relationships among affiliated content entities, Section 8 is for describing relationships among entities that have other types of relationships with each other. Again, Section 9 is for describing relationships among related agent entities. So if one publisher, was a branch off from a larger publisher, then that could be described. And then section 10 is not yet developed, but in theory it's going to be the place to describe relationships among related concepts. And that'll be even more powerful, very semantic webby. Okay, and this brings us to the part where we're really tying together many or all of the concepts that we've been talking about for roughly the past 8 weeks or so. And what it all comes down to in our sort of LBSC 670 perspective on the world is that most or all of the tasks and technologies involved in the organization of information, which is also bibliographic control, those pertain to entities, characteristics of those entities, and relationships among entities. So all we're doing with all these different technologies or different practices or systems or procedures is just trying to take entities, usually information resources, and to describe their characteristics, their attributes, and then to relate them to each other. Very early on in the semester, we learned that hierarchy is the most basic kind of relationship among entities or concepts, but we've also seen that in the list of semantic relationships from early this semester and the list of bibliographic relationships from before, and even just a list of the idiosyncratic relationships that showed up in the Freedmen's Bureau documents. Relationships can come anywhere, and different types of hierarchical relationships can exist among entities. But hierarchy is really this very fundamental cognitive tool for explaining when things are broader or narrower than each other. And it's used heavily in our thoughts, in our conversation, in our communication, and also in bibliographic control and description. And um, this really fundamental set of procedures that we do sort of maps out in this table that I've got here. So over the past few weeks, we've looked at databases, XML, the semantic web, and Ferber and RDA. And so what this table does is it sort of dices out how each of these technologies or approaches treats these fundamental elements that we're dealing with. And those fundamental elements are entities, characteristics, and relationships, because that's all we're doing with bibliographic control, is working with entities, characteristics, and relationships. So in databases, entities are known as entities. Characteristics are known as attributes, and relationships are known as relationships, which are expressed with foreign keys. Entities are expressed as tables, and attributes, for the most part, are expressed as columns in tables. In XML, entities are known as elements, and characteristics can be described using sub-elements or using attributes. And those are both very XML specific mechanisms. And then relationships can be expressed with namespaces, and also the hierarchical relationships can be expressed with the nesting of the elements. But the power there is pretty limited. You can't say much more about the type of hierarchical relationship, just that there is a hierarchical relationship. On the other hand, the semantic web calls their entities classes. Their characteristics or their attributes are called data type properties. And then relationships can be expressed through object properties. Again, we saw examples of those in the Freedmen's Bureau ontology, or as linked data, as we learned about from Amalia's lecture. And finally, in this presentation, we've learned about Ferber and RDA. And Ferber and RDA understand entities as being content entities, agent entities, or concept entities. They're three groups of entities. Characteristics are attributes, and attributes can be of content entities or agent entities, or also concept entities coming soon. And then relationships in Ferber and RDA are expressed through the mechanism of relationships, and again through this linked data concept that was borrowed over from the semantic web, because in RDA any resource should be linked to a uniform resource identifier, a URI, which is just a place on the web that is stable and reliable, where a resource will be described and can be pointed to by other resources in the definition of relationships. And so that's really the big one of the big take-homes for 670, is just understanding that we've got these constructs of entities, characteristics, and relationships, and regardless of which tool or guideline or technology you're using, if you can analyze information in this way and break things down into entities, characteristics, and relationships, you can do library science, or you can do information studies in almost any environment, whether you're a systems analyst or a database designer or a cataloger. There are all sorts of different environments in which you can operate this skill set, and it just applies all over the place. So that wraps up everything for tonight. In our next session, we're going to look at indexing languages and thesauri, and start getting more hands-on with particular types of sort of reference and bibliographic resources.